In the early days of the Internet, many regarded the new digital frontier as a Wild West that was largely unknown and mostly unregulated. Although much has changed, the Internet still has its digital bounty hunters, hackers who spend their days trying to protect businesses from nefarious bugs and vulnerabilities. You will hear about these modern-day vigilantes in today's session of the Traveler's Cyber Academy. Cybersecurity, wearing the white hat. Any company that has an internet presence can potentially be a target for hackers. That may sound scary, but some hackers have good intentions and are actually trying to help improve the security of the internet. The first step for companies that want to take advantage of these white hat hackers is to establish a responsible disclosure program, also known as a vulnerability disclosure program. We will cover those programs in the first part of today's session of the Traveler's Cyber Academy. For companies that want to go a step further, bug bounty programs create incentives that can encourage white hat hackers and security researchers to focus on finding vulnerabilities in a company's most valuable assets. Bug bounties will be covered in the second part of today's session of the Traveler's Cyber Academy. To many people in the cybersecurity industry, being a hacker is not necessarily a bad thing. A hacker is just somebody with expertise in computers and other technology in general, such as cell phones or Internet of Things devices. Hackers like to test limits and to look for unexpected ways to do cool and interesting things. While there are certainly hackers who use their skills for nefarious purposes and illegal financial gains, there are also hackers whose first inclination on finding a vulnerability would be to report it so that it can be fixed. According to a recent report by HackerOne, a company that works with white hat hackers and security researchers, most of its 300,000 hackers are based overseas. About 1 in 4 of them are currently students, and more than half of them are 24 years old or younger. For most of these hackers, hacking is not a full-time job. It is something they do on the side to learn about things that interest them and maybe earn a bounty or two along the way. So what happens when a white hat hacker finds a vulnerability in a company's network or website? In many cases, they will try to contact the company by phone or by email. Unfortunately, many recipients of an email like this would not know what to do. They might delete the email or even report it to law enforcement authorities. The company's employees usually don't know what to do if there is no process in place for handling an unsolicited vulnerability report from an unknown third party. For this reason, government agencies such as the Federal Trade Commission have recommended that companies have an effective process in place to receive and address security vulnerability reports. In fact, companies have been charged with violating the FTC Act based in part on not having such processes in place. That is for a failure to maintain an adequate process for receiving and addressing security vulnerability reports from security researchers and academics. Government agencies have started to address this issue by establishing responsible disclosure programs themselves and by providing written guidance to companies on how to set up responsible disclosure programs, including the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Justice, the General Services Administration, and others. The purpose of these responsible disclosure programs is to provide a channel for security researchers and other white hat hackers to communicate information about security flaws, thereby helping companies keep private and sensitive information both confidential and safe. As the U.S. Department of Defense states in its responsible disclosure policy, the security researcher community regularly makes valuable contributions to the security of organizations and the broader internet. Fostering a relationship with that community can help organizations improve their own cybersecurity. There are 5 principal elements of a responsible disclosure policy. Scope. Here, the organization specifies what systems and applications can be tested and which are off limits. The scope can be narrow, for example, identifying one or two specific systems. Or it can be quite broad. The U.S. Department of Defense, for example, invites hackers to test any public-facing website owned, operated, or controlled by DoD, including web applications hosted on those sites. The organization can also provide guidelines to hackers on what types of attacks are acceptable and set limits on how far a vulnerability should be tested. Next, the authorization or safe harbor provision states that an organization will not take legal action against researchers or hackers who comply with the policy. The policy should also specify how researchers and hackers can report vulnerabilities to the organization and what information should be included. Finally, the coordination provision specifies how the organization will handle reported vulnerabilities, including whether and when the vulnerability will be made public. This last provision is an important part of a responsible disclosure policy, because many security researchers and hackers will choose to go public if the affected organization does not appear to be taking steps to address the vulnerability in a timely and responsible way.
So there are two types of hackers out there. There are friendly hackers that want to help you, and there are cyber criminals. And if you don't have a process for the friendly hackers to contact you, the only ones that are coming after you are the criminals. In my opinion, like any company that exists on the internet and has something on the web needs to have a responsible disclosure policy, because it means that once you're connected to the web in however way, there is a chance that someone like a customer of yours or an external security researcher that might stumble upon a vulnerability. And if it's unknown how to contact that company to report the vulnerability, then the security researcher might not know what to do, so they might not tell you about it, or they might try alternative methods to get in contact. Before I founded HackerOne, I was a hacker myself, which means that I found lots of vulnerabilities, typically in products and services and software that I was using myself. And it was very hard to tell companies about those vulnerabilities. So it kind of like always led to this frustration of, hey, there's software I'm using and I depend on my personal information in the system, but it has vulnerabilities, and somehow I can't contact the company to report the security vulnerability to them. You could try to email their customer support team, or you could try to call their customer support phone number. Typically, it's not the right place for a vulnerability to land, since the customer support team typically is not equipped to technically understand a security vulnerability. So it's really, again, really important for those companies to set up a process for taking in the security vulnerabilities from possible outside security researchers. The hackers that participate in bug bounty platforms are very just normal human beings. They don't look like anything that you see in the Hollywood movies where they type really fast on computers and have text flying off their screen. They're just normal hackers, and they look like anyone else that can work with a computer. And it's really a global community with hackers from all different ages. There are hackers that are still in high school, and we have hackers that are academics. We have hackers that have professional jobs at large companies, and they kind of do this hacking thing on the side. The big motivation for a hacker is typically just the intellectual challenge of trying to break something. So hackers are naturally very curious, and they're also very creative. So it is kind of like an art of trying to find your way around some kind of protection that someone puts in front of you. So you're trying to think about a different way of bypassing a security limitation. Or the commonalities between a cyber criminal and a white hat hacker is that they have a similar skill. Like, they know how to creatively overcome a limitation that is put in front of them. So like, they're trying to break into a system. They both have the same skill of breaking into the system. The difference is what you actually do with the information. Where a cyber criminal would take the information and maybe sell it somewhere else, the white hat hacker would actually report the vulnerability to the company that has the vulnerability and get it resolved. The word hacker has a very broad definition, but in my expertise, I like to focus on application security. So I like to focus on trying to break into typically web applications, a little bit of mobile applications as well, but most of my time is spent on web applications. There are hackers that focus on very different aspects of software, like they could focus on the network infrastructure behind it, they could focus on the cloud infrastructure behind it. There are hackers that focus on hardware. They like to take hardware apart and actually tinker with the hardware itself and reverse engineer how the system was built. So there's lots of different expertises of where hackers like to invest their time. So the first thing I look at when deciding what company to hack on is, does the application or does the software they offer, does that interest me? So like for me personally, I like to focus on applications that have some kind of like regulation or compliance that they have to stay within. Sometimes the biggest vulnerabilities that our hackers find, sometimes the most interesting ones are those that have kind of like a physical nature. Like we've had hackers that find vulnerabilities that impact something in the physical world. Like you could think about like opening or closing a bridge. Those of course are like really cool vulnerabilities, but it's typically not like the most critical one. Even though it sounds really cool, it's probably something from the movies. The most critical vulnerabilities are typically those that expose like large amounts of user information. Because we're living in the era of like mega data breaches where like people's information is sold, and finding vulnerabilities that expose like large amounts of financial information or health information from people, those tend to be the most critical vulnerabilities that our hackers find. So the first step a hacker typically takes in their process after they've decided who they're going to target is they'll do their reconnaissance. And a large part of the reconnaissance is simply just Googling, like Googling the company name, Googling kind of the domain names the company might own, maybe some important executives or people that work there. They might just Google those names and kind of see what they come back with, like what kind of systems are they using? What are they writing about themselves? Are they on social media writing about the company there? So those could be interesting pieces of information that help a hacker better understand the target. And that's typically step one. And step two would be to look at the application that they might target. So if there's an application offered, what does that application do? And I personally then try to understand or kind of get an idea for what the software does on the back end. Of course, the back end isn't visible. It's not something you can touch or see. So you have to kind of guess and just come up with a theory of like, what if it worked this way? And if it worked that way, how would I go around that? And then it's just many, many different tries. You try many different theories and you kind of touch in the dark for a long time until you get some signal back that you're on the right track. And then you might continue to invest your time there and potentially stumble upon a vulnerability. So the most important tool a hacker can use is their own curiosity. Like if you're not naturally curious as a hacker, it's going to be very tough to try to break into something because you need that curiosity.
By establishing a responsible disclosure policy, businesses can ensure that hackers and security researchers know how to report a vulnerability if a vulnerability is found. Many businesses, however, try to be more proactive and want to actively encourage white hat hackers to test their defenses. One way to do so is to offer an incentive, or a bug bounty, for hackers who find and report a vulnerability. After all, it's a given that cyber criminals are out there looking for vulnerabilities. Establishing a bug bounty program gives white hat hackers an incentive to find those vulnerabilities before the criminals can. Most companies that want to offer bug bounties will use a commercial bug bounty platform that connects them to an existing, vetted community of hackers and security researchers. The first step is for the company to define the scope of the program. That is, what systems or applications the company wants to have tested. The company can also define the conditions of payment. That is, what information a hacker needs to provide about a vulnerability and how the value of each vulnerability will be determined. More on that later. Second, hackers and security researchers are invited to begin testing. This can be an open invitation to all hackers on the platform, or if particularly sensitive systems are being tested, the invitation can be limited to hackers who have gone through a more rigorous screening process. Most bug bounty platforms also help companies to screen or validate reported vulnerabilities. This will reduce the number of false positives that the company needs to deal with. Vulnerabilities that are validated by the bug bounty platform are then reported to the company, which is responsible for remediating the vulnerability. And the hacker is paid a bounty according to the terms set up by the bug bounty program. One significant advantage of a formal bug bounty program is that, in many cases, it can allow a company to learn about and fix vulnerabilities without those vulnerabilities ever being made public. So how much is a bug worth? The amount paid by companies for a disclosed vulnerability can vary considerably, from thousands of dollars up to a six-figure payout. The bounty paid will most often depend on how critical the vulnerability is, but other factors can include the number of systems affected and whether the systems affected are still being tested or have already been deployed. In one well-publicized bug bounty program, Hack the Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense paid approximately $150,000 to identify 138 legitimate and unique vulnerabilities, averaging just under $1,100 per vulnerability. According to the DoD, hiring an outside contractor to conduct similar testing could have cost the department more than $1 million. Interestingly, not all bug bounties are paid in cash. At least one airline, for example, has awarded frequent flyer mileage to white hat hackers for finding new vulnerabilities.
At HackerOne, we see clients from all kinds of company sizes, from very large enterprises to very small businesses. For a lot of small and medium-sized companies, you don't have the luxury to have like a large security team with hundreds of security experts on the team that actively defend against attacks and test for security issues all day. So really what helps is enlisting this help from a large global hacker community that has the expertise and can help find vulnerabilities and defend against potential threats. So sometimes we get the question of whether or not launching a bug bounty program kind of like invites cyber criminals to target you. And I really see that kind of as a non-issue, because when you connect yourself to the internet, you already open yourself to cyber criminals. But you don't necessarily open yourself to friendly security researchers and friendly hackers that want to submit vulnerabilities, because they're waiting for the invitation. So in order to get paid on the platform, we need to collect information about the individuals, about who they are, where they live, what their name is, and all those types of information. On top of that, we also provide extra vetting for more sensitive projects. Like there are bug bounty programs that run on very sensitive computer systems. And typically we perform extra vetting on top of that, things like background checking and clearances that we check. We typically recommend that more for systems that need to be tested that aren't publicly available. So anything that is just publicly accessible over the internet that anyone can access regardless, we just use our reputation system as the form of vetting. And then when the systems get a little bit more sensitive, like it isn't public internet, it's more like an internal system, that's when we send in hackers that have undergone background checks and extra vetting. The hackers are paid based on the severity of the vulnerability, and each program can set the payout they give for a critical vulnerability or high severity vulnerability or medium severity vulnerability. They can kind of set the range of payouts they want. And with each level of payout, you attract a different kind of hacker. We've seen programs that pay, for instance, up to $1,500 for critical. We've also seen programs that pay up to $250,000 for a critical vulnerability. The criticality of a vulnerability or the severity of a vulnerability is typically decided by some kind of severity scoring mechanism. So at HackerOne, we typically recommend those that don't have a system yet to use CVSS, which stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. And that kind of is like a standard for how you define the severity of a vulnerability based on a few attributes of how easy it is to find, what the impact is of exploiting it, what the potential business impact is, and some severity rating will roll out of that. For instance, it could be a high severity, and from that you can derive a bounty payment. And the size of the bounty then is kind of up to the company to decide what they want to pay for each level of severity. We typically recommend that if you don't have a formal bug bounty program, to don't do those ad hoc or one-off payments. It's better to think through setting up a formal program than to do one-off rewards that you don't really know how it's going to end up. In the formal process, you kind of define the rules of engagement, like what are the limitations of where a researcher can test, what is the scope, what are the things that are outside of the scope. And if you don't have a process like that yet, paying a one-off, paying for one vulnerability might invite additional testing. And if there's not that process and the rules aren't set up, it's hard to control where the testing will go, when it will stop, or if it goes within or without the scope. Yeah, what we see most as a source of potential vulnerabilities is the use of third-party software that many small and medium businesses kind of depend on to run their business, but misconfiguring it. So they might integrate it into their own systems, and they might be sending information and personal information about their business, about their customers back and forth between those third parties. And if there's some kind of misconfiguration there, it could lead to leaking that information in some way. And typically the most valuable information that can be leaked is something like PII, personal identifiable information, or financial information, or health records. It's of course important for companies to have have good security health and implement all the normal best practices. And if you need to be PCI compliant, follow everything that PCI prescribes you have to do in terms of security. Kind of those things, like you need to have that in place at a minimum in order to have just general good security hygiene. But it's never enough to just be compliant with a security standard or to just follow the best practices. The number one step I would recommend everyone is to at least have some kind of responsible disclosure policy in place. Because there are people out there that might have information about vulnerabilities. And if there's an easy way for them to tell you about it, then you can act on those vulnerabilities before they can be exploited and lead to a potential data breach.
In some respects, bug bounty programs are similar to third-party penetration testing. Many organizations with mature cybersecurity programs will do both. Unlike penetration testing, which requires an upfront payment, bug bounty programs are pay for performance. A bounty will be paid only if a vulnerability is found. Another difference is that penetration testing is usually conducted by a small team of security professionals, whereas a bug bounty program can be used to pull in hundreds of hackers with potentially more diverse skills and more creative ways of attacking. On the other hand, penetration testing can be used for evaluating both externally visible and internal-only systems, whereas bug bounty programs are best suited for externally visible systems. It is possible for a bug bounty program to be used on an internal system, but there can be more work involved in setting that up. Finally, a penetration test should result in a written report, which may be required for regulatory compliance. The same is not generally true of a bug bounty program. Both vulnerability disclosure programs and bug bounty programs are important tools that businesses should consider when structuring their cybersecurity programs. Hopefully, most businesses already recognize that no matter how diligent or careful they are, vulnerabilities can exist in their network, systems, and applications. A bug bounty program can help businesses identify these vulnerabilities more proactively. Once found, it is important for businesses to address vulnerabilities effectively, meaning patch in a timely fashion across the entire organization. To do that, businesses need a strong vulnerability management program. Finally, to protect against vulnerabilities that are missed or that are not patched before they are exploited, companies should consider obtaining cyber insurance as part of any risk management program. Thank you very much for your time today. We hope you enjoyed this session of the Travelers Cyber Academy on cybersecurity, wearing the white hat. If you have any further questions, please contact us at trvcyber@ems.travelers.com. Or for a replay of this session, to share with your colleagues and find additional resources on this topic, please visit travelers.com/cyber.